Welcome to the National Balloon Museum Ballooning Pioneers series, and our ballooning pioneer for today is Tom Sheppard, and he is been in ballooning since 1973,
Right.
and is still in ballooning. Now, some people might say he's full of hot air, but we're going to see right now exactly how much. So, Mr. Sheppard, Tom, I'll call you Tom.
That's good.
Tom, you were one of several Americans that went over to England to learn about the Observer Corps, which is was still being used over there. And would you tell us a little bit about how they tried to train you?
Well, they announced that at the 77 Worlds, they were going to use observers. And we had never heard of observers over here. And they were going to try some new rules, which we were interested in. And so a number of us applied to be observers during the 77 Worlds. And I was on the events committee, and I was interested in learning what this observer thing was all about so that we could possibly use it in the U.S. So we went to the Worlds in York. It's actually in Castle Howard, but we stayed in York. And it was quite an experience because they had never done it before, and the debriefing, when we came back from the flight, we had to wait 4 to 6 hours to get debriefed, and it was the middle of the night sometimes before we'd finished, and we had to drive all the way back to York to our hotel. And anyway, I was able to get through the week. Being an observer, I flew several times with pilots, and on the other times I followed with the retrieve vehicles, and decided that this new set of rules and the observer use was something we should do in the U.S. So we, Debbie Spaeth and I got together and wrote up an observer handbook, which we used at Wisconsin Dells to experiment ourselves with this observer system so that I could use it at the Nationals in 78 and 79, because I was going to be director those 2 years. And that was the start of using observers in the U.S. It was very successful, and we had these new rules which we modified for the U.S. use, and we used them for the 2 years in the Nationals, and other organizers that had competition used them, and we used them at Wisconsin Dells for 15 or so years after that.
Wow. All right. Why did you feel that the Observer Corps was a necessary ingredient to the flying at the Nationals? Why was it so important? Was it, to make it easier for the scoring, easier on the pilot? Why?
Well, it gave us the flexibility to call tasks that could not have been called without observers. When I flew in the Nationals in 1976, we had a set pattern. We had to do, I think it was 8, what they called CNTEs, which is fly-ins, as we call them today. And you picked the best 2. Then you did an elbow, and I think we did a hare and hound. But I don't really remember very well. I remember doing the elbow, and I remember doing the fly-ins, or the CNTEs as they called them. And that didn't require the type of scoring that needed observers. But when we got to tasks like what they call in Europe the hesitation waltz, and we call the multiple judge declared goal, and pilot declared goals, and tasks like that, then observers are almost essential. You really can't call a pilot declared goal with any kind of flexibility if you don't have observers.
All right, when you, after you'd learned the rules of observing in England, or I'm guessing the rest of the world, do they have the same kind of observer rules other than in the United States?
Well, they do now, yes. That's gradually evolved over the years from the original observers that were used in York in the English World Championship. Most countries use observers. Now, there's a different philosophy. A lot of countries, observers are willing to pay their own way because that's a means for them to get into ballooning because of the costs and the money involved. We over here, observers, we've never asked them to pay their own way. And so we've had a slightly different type of situation in the U.S. than in most of the world, but it's Japan has been the big user of observers in the last 20-odd years with two major events. One in Saga, Japan, which has been going since 1985, and another one it's now in Motegi. That's been going for 9 or 10 years also. And they have huge, huge budgets that they can afford to bring foreign observers in.
So have you gone over there to observe, or are you in charge of the observers over there?
No, I've not been in charge of observers anywhere really. I've done dozens of observer classes where we've taught newcomers to be observers, but I've never been the chief observer at an event. I've been the event director usually, or a chairman of the jury where they've used observers. I did observing only once, and that was in England, and then I brought the concept over here and taught other people to do it, and they took it and ran with it.
Uh-huh. Now, when you brought it over here, did you have to change anything to make it work better in the United States, or did you pretty much leave the rules and what they had to do other than the difference of the races?
Well, I was on the events committee at that time for the BFA, and we took the world rules that were used in York, and we went through them and changed what we felt was necessary for use in the U.S., and then we published them as BFA sanctioned rules, which were used for many years, at least all the time that I was involved actively with the BFA, which was up until 1998, I think, back then.
Now, are there any differences in the responsibilities of an observer for a gas balloon over a hot air balloon?
Not really. We introduced observers to gas balloons when I was the director for the Worlds in Tyndall in 1990. And observers for gas balloon races have to be prepared to be gone for several days sometimes. One of the tasks I called, for example, in Tyndall, which is in South Dakota, was a maximum distance. And some of the balloons ended up in Oklahoma. So those observers were gone for quite some time. But we introduced the concept of observers into gas ballooning, and we also introduced in the World Championships of gas ballooning tasks that were somewhat similar to what we used in hot air balloons. And the Europeans came over here and just loved it. They were all very pleased with that type of flying. That was very challenging for them as gas balloonists.
Now, sometimes in hot air, the observer rides in the balloon. Now, when you're going for a great distance in a small area, do the observers ride, for a gas balloon, do they ride in the balloon or do they ride in the chase vehicle?
They ride in the retrieve vehicle. I don't know of any that have ever ridden in a gas balloon, because there's a pilot and a co-pilot on board, and they're the ones who are using the space in the basket, as it were.
And there's not much of that. Right.
No, there's not.
So, all right, in the, let's see. All right, if you had anything that you wanted to make sure that people understood about the observer or the observer corps or the rules, what would be one thing that would stand out?
Well, the one thing that I think we had some problems with is that observers get much too friendly with pilots. In other words, they don't keep their distance, as it were, because they're officials and a competitor is a competitor, and during the event, you have to keep separate, because you sometimes have to report infractions of the pilot, and you don't want an observer being influenced by a given pilot, which I'm afraid all too often happens these days.
Now, the observer corps in most races is being phased out. For what reason?
Money. The sponsorships for balloon events are drying up, albeit slowly, but they are. And observers is an expense that we have to face up to. In the U.S., we've gradually stopped the use of observers at many events. They've still kept them at the U.S. Nationals, I understand, but they are starting to stop using them internationally. And I believe I'm right in saying that Austria is not sure whether they're going to be able to get the money to use them or not. But it's strictly money. If we could get some good sponsorships and get the money, I would love to use observers, although I don't direct anymore. But observers are an important part of competition, which is, I'm very sad to say, is going away.
All right. Now, moving on, I noticed that the Canadian Balloon Association presents several awards in sport ballooning, one being the Joan Martin Award, which recognizes balloonists in a variety of areas: technical, competition, contribution to Canadian ballooning, and the advancement on sport records. Now, I noticed that you have been honored twice in that, I think 1979, 1984. Could you please explain how you helped in those various areas, or what areas that you were honored in?
Well, I was the event director for the Canadian National Championship for 5 years in Canada for the Canadians. And most recently, Debbie and I have been up there as officials for their nationals in 2003, I think, and 2000. But back in the 70s and 80s, I believe, was the time frame. I was the event director in Canada, and we flew with observers and the type of tasks that we've been talking about up in Grande Prairie, Alberta. And I also was event director for a North American championship, 2 North American championships up there, one in Grande Prairie and one in Barrie, Ontario. So that's really the extent of my contribution to Canadian ballooning.
Now, did you qualify for the Canadian Balloon Association? Do they give it to Americans, or since you come from England, is that how you made it into that category?
No, they give it to anybody that
Does a good job?
well, I don't know if that does a good job, but who they consider has made a contribution. I don't think your nationality has any bearing on it.
I
No.
see. Now, the Joan Martin, do you know who they're honoring with that award?
She's a lady balloonist, I believe, from Alberta. I think I might have met her the very first year that I went to Canada. But, you know, I get these lapses in memory these days, and I don't remember everything from back then.
Well, I mean, you've met a lot of people from all around the world, so I just wondered, because I thought it was unique that they honored a woman.
She was, well, I don't think so. I think she was a pioneer in ballooning in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
She was one of the original balloonists in Canada. I mean, I can, when I was sitting out in your parking lot, I was talking to a Calgary, Alberta, and I wish I knew you were going to ask me that, because I would have asked him to refresh my memory as to who she is.
Well, you just never know.
Oh.
All right, you've done a lot of competition, flying, dealing on the competition board, you know, the grievance committee, all these. What has intrigued you so much about competition?
Well, I'm one of those people that believe that when you fly, you have to fly with a purpose. Well, when people tell me, well, I'm going for a pleasure flight or I'm going for a fun flight, well, what is a fun flight? You just take off and you fly and you land and you have nothing in mind. I don't like to fly that way. I like the competition. Doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be particularly hot shot type of competition. Just aiming for a target or aiming for a goal or doing something that you have a mission once you get in the air. Just like when I was in the Navy, we always had a mission, and so competition appealed to me because it gave you something to shoot for, always.
So, in other words, you only fly when you, like in a contest or a rally or an event, not just to say, it's a nice day, let's go.
Well, primarily, yes. I've had to fly in other types of things for different reasons. You know, I was a FAA examiner for 10 years, so I had to fly with students to give them a check ride. But then I was flying with a mission. I was flying to give these students, or hopefully give these students, their private pilot certificate or their commercial pilot certificate. But I always like to, if possible, to fly with some kind of mission.
Did you ever keep track of how many people that you had passed or not passed on their license?
No, In the US, it's a certificate. We don't have a license.
Certificate.
Overseas, their licenses, and we have driver licenses. But a pilot certificate never expires. So for a balloonist, it's forever. But going back to your question, no, we tried to recap that several months ago because at the time, and with my logbooks, I don't know where some of them are, and so I don't know. It was a lot. They used to come to me from Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. So I gave quite a few of them check rides.
Did you, in the early days, if you flew a Raven or if you flew a Barnes, if that's the kind that you flew with, I mean, there was a lot of competition-wise. Did you have a particular that you trained or tested, like, for a certain balloon? Or
You
just,
mean for check rides?
yeah.
No, any kind of balloon. I started to learn to fly on a Raven, it was Raven back then, and with the metal gondola, and I got hurt on the second flight. And so it was quite a while before I could get back to flying again. It was several months, and then by then we had our own balloon, which was a Balloon Works, or Barnes as it was called then, one of the very first barns they ever built. And so I was used to flying that. But I would have someone check me out over the years in the different balloons, a Picard and balloons like that, so that when I did a check ride for somebody, I was familiar with the balloon.
All right, now with since we're talking about different balloons, with the news of Aerostar choosing not to make any new balloons after January 1, that's the last of the original three. We had Picard, Semco, and at that time Raven. What are your feelings on? It's kind of like an end of an era for Aerostar.
Well, I think many things are coming to an era, from an era on ballooning. It's really the fact that the price is such that you just can't afford to buy a balloon with the prices they are today. We paid, for our first new balloon, we paid $5,000. For our second balloon, which was in effect just a few weeks later, which was the prototype AX6 that Barnes had used for their test flying and certification, we paid $4,800. Well, back in those days, we could afford that, even though we couldn't fly every day or all year because of weather considerations. So there's only certain parts of the country where you can fly extensively, and with the price of balloons they are today, it's going to diminish. Just like the membership in the BFA is diminishing. It peaked in 1986 with like 4,800 members. When I joined the BFA, we had 232 pilot members. So it peaked, and now it's diminishing because of the expense, number one, and because, like all aviation, including fixed wing, we're losing the interest in aviation that we had when I was a boy and when I joined the service. You know, in the Second World War, we needed lots of pilots, and after that, they didn't seem to want as many pilots, so there was less interest in it. And the same thing, I think, has happened with ballooning. So the lack of interest in aviation, the cost involved is what is causing the manufacturers to start looking at what they're doing, and and Aerostar did that and found that hot air balloons or sport ballooning was not as profitable as they needed it to be as compared to their other divisions.
I talked to Mark West, who is the president or CEO
Right.
of Aerostar, and he said people kept asking for better material to last longer, and that at first it was like 400 hours, now their material lasts 800 hours and won't tear, you could pull or rip everything. And he said, basically, we just made it so good they don't buy new balloons, because nowadays people don't fly, like hundreds of hours unless they're a commercial balloonist. So that's part of it. But I noticed as soon as he put out the word that they weren't gonna make them after January 1, that he got all these new orders, so they're way into July before they're done.
Yeah, before they're finished.
But that they would take care of the ones that they have, but just not build new ones.
Yeah,
So,
that's good. They, see, the Aerostar was a big corporation, or is a big corporation. They do other things besides hot air balloons. The Balloon Works, Lindstrand, and Cameron only make sport balloons. So, but they're only very small companies, and they don't have other divisions that they can compare their costs and profits to. So Aerostar actually, in my opinion, come under a completely different category than all other balloon manufacturers, because all other balloon manufacturers are just very small. They're easily controlled by the CEO or the president. They can cut their costs, they can cut this and that very simply, and they don't have shareholders to answer to, whereas I'm sure Aerostar has to keep certain levels to keep a division going.
now, I wanna go back to competition a little bit, and several years ago, I think it was 91, when the competition division went in with NABA. Was that in 91?
No,
No.
that was, it started in 98.
In 98, okay.
And there's an excellent publication called Dead Center Drop that gives the full history of that split and why the split took place. In 1998, the BFA board, because of some of the actions of the CD board, wanted to close the division down and make them again a committee of the BFA. And so the people that were on the CD board,
Which means competition division.
yes, of which I wasn't one. I had other duties behind the scenes that I worked on for the competition division. They didn't want to do this and didn't want to have the competition division disbanded, but the BFA did it anyway. So what they also did was they fired the rest of us, including me, from the president wrote and said, I want everything you have with regards to the CD and competition. So I was the keeper of the rules. I did the rules, I did the software for scoring. So I sent all that to the president. I can't remember his name. He was out west. He was president after Rob Shantz. Sundquist, his last name was. And Charlie Sundquist, yeah, now I'm remembering. And so I sent him all the stuff, and that was my last active involvement with competition within the BFA. And so the people that left the BFA because of this split said, well, we have the expertise to run balloon events, so should we form a group to run balloon events for ourselves? And so they formed NABA. And this
Can you
was
say what that stands for?
North American Balloon Association. And this was actually no different from when I was on the BFA board, when Bill Meadows had the National Balloon Racing Association. And he was doing an identical thing to what NABA was doing. He was running private races. And in fact, when I was on the board, he came to us with a proposal to run the BFA Nationals. And the BFA turned him down. But NABA was formed to run races, to have a ranking system, and to hold a NABA Nationals. And we had a ranking system which I kept on the computer in my office. I was in charge of rules, the ranking, and GPS. We purchased a lot of GPS to use in competition. And so we were running competition from 1999 until the December 2006 when we disbanded.
Now, in all that time, do you think that NABA, the people who started NABA, felt that they had accomplished and done what they set out to do?
Oh, I think so. Nobody realized that NABA would become a competitor for the BFA. But as it turned out, it was perceived that NABA was going to be a competitor or was a competitor of the BFA, and we were disappointed that BFA didn't continue aggressively with some kind of competition division or competition committee. And NABA had the expertise and was running events, and the BFA didn't seem to want to compete with them, or at least that's the way we perceived it. But I think NABA was a good thing for competition. We had our own rules, we had our own events. In later years, we said if you want to use sanction points for your own sanctions in the BFA, we're happy to do that, which they did for a couple of, or at least 1 year. I know I used to send them in, and then I think the next year they didn't want to do it, or I can't remember really.
Who were some of the original people that started NABA?
Well, Dick Rudloff, Jim Burke, David Lowe, myself, Tom Tyler, Alan Yost. Oh, Patty Kramer. Yeah, she was a scorer. Yeah.
And so throughout from 98 to 2006, did most of those people still remain in charge or handling it?
All of them did, yes.
All of them did.
Well, except Tom Tyler, who died
Well,
sadly a couple of years ago.
well, that's one way to get off a committee. Yeah.
Well, that was a big blow to us because he was our treasurer. And he kept the books, and every penny that went into NABA, that paid into NABA, was paid back to the pilots.
In prize money?
Well, in ranking money,
Oh, I see.
more than prize money. Individual events would give prize money, but everything the pilots paid in, they kept, and then I kept a ranking list. And so the first 30 pilots on the ranking list each year got paid. The top one got $1,000, I think it was. I wasn't really involved in that. 500, next one, and so it went down the list. But I was not the person who handled that, I just handled the ranking list.
As you worked with NABA, if there was anything that you thought could have been tweaked or changed or done differently, what would it have been?
Nothing really. I guess my only disappointment was that it was very difficult to try and negotiate to work with the BFA board. But then I knew that would happen from my own experience on the BFA board and some of my experiences before being on the board, how hard it was to work with some of these people that get on the board.
Well, just to move into that topic, and you were on the BFA board for
Yes,
just one term.
Right.
And being on that board, did that, what can you say about what you learned from being on that board?
Well, I learned that most of your board members don't want to do anything. And if you give them a project, they come to the next board meeting and no, they haven't had time to do it. And I learned that the higher you get, the more they snip at you. I was president for a couple of years, and I hated that because I thought it would be like being on the events committee, but it wasn't. So I decided that I didn't want any part of that, and I didn't run again.
Now, being on the BFA board, did it intrigue you to want to go to like the CIA or international flying in different organizations?
Oh, well, I'd been going to the CIA meetings as an observer for a long time. And then I became the alternate delegate, and then I became the delegate. So for several years, under the presidency of Carl Stephan, and we had a German and a Frenchman who were presidents before Carl. I had attended the CIA and been involved in approving world rules and approving this for different things for competition.
And could you tell us what CIA means other than the one we're familiar with here in this country?
It's the Committee International Aerostation.
And that is kind
That's
of
an
like
arm, that's the ballooning arm of the FAI, which is the Fédération Aéronautique International.
which kind of runs everything
Well,
except
they're,
the United
yes,
States.
they're the world body for sport aviation. They keep records for all the different aviation functions, including space, and they have different divisions, and the CIA is one of them, and they have a general aviation and a helicopter and a sailplane, glider sailplane group. So they have all these different divisions that they have.
Okay. Now, I noticed that you are an author too on top of everything else that you do, and that you've written some booklets and some pamphlets that are used kind of widely through ballooning seminars or safety seminars. All right. Do you have any in the making right now?
No, I've given up all that kind of thing. I used to write a lot of material 4 safety seminars because I used to speak a lot at safety seminars. And because I used to work very closely with the FAA in many areas, I would write up material that involved, you know, the FAA and ballooning. And in particular, the thing I learned when I first started ballooning was that we used propane, liquid propane, and nobody knew anything about it. And that was disastrous in my mind, and so I spent a lot of time learning all the details of propane, how it worked, and what it did and why, and all the different components we used, you know, why a given burner had a pressure regulator, and all that kind of thing. And so that was one of my fascinations. The very first burner was patented in 1904 in my hometown of Newbury in England. And I didn't know that until I got into ballooning. But the Reverend Bacon designed and built the first hot air balloon with a hot air burner, which was paraffin or kerosene fired with a pressure vessel. And so, you know, I worked on that a little in the history of burners.
I wasn't aware of that. All right, if you could choose something to write on that you think that people need to know more on, or your interest level, what would you write?
Well, it would be something in competition. I'm still, although I'm not involved actively with the BFA anymore, I am involved internationally with, you know, we have a group of us now, one from Australia, one from England, one from Canada, myself, and the one from Japan just died. But our group is working on altimetry and the use of GPS for altitude use in competition. And so we've been working on that for about a year now. And we also have, we're also working now on what we can do about the problems we had at this last World Championship with pilots who get a little carried away with their flying habits.
Would you care to delve into that? Sounds like a good story.
Well, it's something that I'm very disappointed in. We seem to have a different breed of competitors coming along that we didn't used to have when I was actively involved in all aspects of the sport. They're very aggressive now, much more aggressive than they ever were. And we had some of these aggressive signs at the Worlds. And I didn't like it because it was upsetting the people who had to be around their balloons like observers. I don't like to see an observer come back to the debriefing room crying because she's been scared to death in the balloon. And that upsets me. I don't think there's anything I can do or anybody else can do about it. It's just the way things are today.
And I think with this new shape of balloon, the one that looks like a football, which goes up quickly and comes down quickly, that's going to be an addition to that.
Well, I think it's an additional hazard when a pilot, uses it to its full limitation, well, over its limitation. We're just doing, in fact, an analysis of that. In fact, that's why I was on the phone to Calgary, or they were on the phone to me when I was waiting to come in here. We're doing an analysis of what happened at the Worlds. And we're doing an analysis, the person who's writing the software to do it is up in Calgary. And we're trying to determine all aspects of this high rate of ascent and descent, and what their speed is, how long they were doing that speed, how high they were above the ground. And then the software will also pull in the tracks of any balloons that were close to them during that period. So we're in the middle of experimenting with that analysis right now.
Wow.